June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. Major Friedrich von Luck stood inside his concrete bunker overlooking the beaches and allowed himself a slight smile. The German officer commanded a panzer battalion in the 21st Panzer Division. He had been fighting for 4 years. He had survived the Russian front. He understood what modern warfare looked like, and he was not impressed by what British artillery could do to him. The bunker was a masterpiece of German engineering. The walls were reinforced concrete more than 6 feet thick. The ceiling was layered with concrete and steel. The whole structure was buried under tons of earth. British shells had been falling on these positions for hours. Von Luck could hear the explosions outside. They were loud, but not threatening. The bunker barely shook. The lights flickered occasionally, but stayed on. His maps and papers remained undisturbed on the table. Von Luck knew that his men were safe in similar bunkers scattered across the defensive line. The British were wasting ammunition. German military doctrine emphasized fortress construction. The Atlantic Wall had been built over 3 years using the Reich's best engineers and millions of tons of concrete. These were not simple bunkers. They were underground fortresses designed to withstand anything the Allies could throw at them. Or so the Germans believed. What von Luck didn't know was that British artillery had evolved into something the Wehrmacht had never encountered. The guns preparing to fire on his position were not the weapons Germany remembered from the First World War. They were part of a system that would revolutionize artillery warfare, a system that would turn German bunkers into tombs. The British had been developing new artillery tactics and technologies throughout the war. They had studied every lesson from every battlefield. They had analyzed what worked and what didn't. They had developed fire control systems that allowed unprecedented accuracy. They had created ammunition specifically designed to destroy concrete fortifications. They had trained their gunners to standards that exceeded anything in the German army. Most importantly, they had developed a command and control system that could mass the fire of hundreds of guns onto single targets with devastating precision. The Germans were about to discover that their concrete fortresses were not invincible. British artillery in 1944 was fundamentally different from British artillery in 1940. 4 years of warfare had forced massive improvements in every aspect of gunnery. The guns themselves were better. The 25-pounder field gun had been refined and improved. New heavy guns had been developed. The 5.5-inch medium gun could destroy fortifications that smaller guns couldn't touch. The 7.2-inch howitzer fired shells weighing nearly 200 pounds. These weapons could demolish concrete structures that would have resisted lighter guns. But the real revolution wasn't in the guns themselves. It was in how the British used them. Fire control had been transformed by new technologies and new tactics. British artillery units were equipped with radio sets that allowed instant communication between observers, gun batteries, and headquarters. This meant that fire could be directed and adjusted in real time. An observer spotting a target could have shells falling on it within minutes. If the first rounds missed, corrections could be transmitted immediately. The guns would adjust and fire again. This cycle could repeat until the target was destroyed. The speed and accuracy were unprecedented. German artillery still relied heavily on telephone lines that could be cut by shell fire. British radio communications were harder to disrupt. Survey techniques had been revolutionized. British gunners used scientific methods to determine exact positions and ranges. They used theodolites and mathematical calculations to achieve accuracy that would have been impossible a few years earlier. They created detailed maps showing every German position. They pre-calculated firing data for hundreds of potential targets. When orders came to fire on a specific location, the gunners already had the correct settings. They could open fire within seconds. This speed and precision gave British artillery enormous tactical advantage. German positions that thought they were hidden discovered that British guns knew exactly where they were. The British had also developed new types of ammunition specifically designed for different targets. High explosive shells were effective against troops in the open, but less effective against concrete bunkers. Armor-piercing shells could penetrate concrete, but had limited blast effect. The British developed shells that combined both characteristics. They created ammunition with delayed fuses that allowed the shell to penetrate concrete before exploding. The explosion inside the bunker was far more devastating than an explosion on the surface. They developed shells with proximity fuses that exploded at optimal height above the target. These airbursts were deadly against troops in trenches or behind low walls. German soldiers discovered that their defensive positions offered less protection than they had believed. But perhaps the most important innovation was in command and control. British artillery had developed a system where multiple batteries could fire simultaneously on a single target. This concentration of fire was called a stonk. When a stonk was ordered, dozens or even hundreds of guns would fire at once. The target would be saturated with shells in seconds. The psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction. Soldiers who survived a stonk were often too shocked to fight effectively. German troops called these concentrated bombardments the most terrifying thing they had experienced in the war, more frightening than aerial bombing, more frightening than tank attacks. The earth itself seemed to be trying to kill them. The development of these capabilities had taken years of work. British artillery had started the war with outdated doctrine and equipment. The disasters of 1940 in France had revealed serious deficiencies. British guns were good, but British gunnery was not. Fire control was slow and inaccurate. Communication systems were inadequate. Training was insufficient. The British Army had to rebuild its artillery arm from the ground up. They brought in the best instructors. They established rigorous training programs. They tested new equipment and new tactics. They studied German artillery methods and developed counters. By 1944, British artillery had been transformed into one of the most effective fighting arms of any army in the world. German officers like Major von Luck had not fully grasped this transformation. German intelligence reports noted improvements in British artillery, but didn't appreciate their full significance. German doctrine still assumed that well-constructed bunkers could resist artillery bombardment. German training emphasized fortress defense. German soldiers were taught that staying in fortified positions was safer than being caught in the open. These assumptions were about to be tested against British artillery at its peak effectiveness. The test would not go well for Germany. The morning of June 6 had begun with massive naval bombardment. British battleships and cruisers had fired thousands of shells at German positions. The bombardment was impressive, but not particularly effective. Naval guns fired flat trajectories that were good for destroying surface targets, but less effective against dug-in positions. Many shells overshot their targets or hit areas that were already destroyed. German troops in deep bunkers were relatively safe from naval gunfire. Major von Luck had watched the naval bombardment with professional interest. It confirmed his belief that British firepower was more spectacular than dangerous. His bunker had barely trembled during hours of naval shelling. He assumed that British field artillery would be similarly ineffective. What von Luck didn't know was that British artillery doctrine specifically avoided the mistakes of naval gunnery. British field guns fired in high arcs that allowed shells to fall steeply onto targets. This plunging fire was far more effective against fortifications than the flat trajectories of naval guns. British gunners had spent years perfecting techniques for destroying concrete bunkers. They knew exactly how many shells of what type were needed to demolish different fortifications. They had tables and calculations that took all variables into account. When British artillery opened fire on a German bunker, it was not random bombardment. It was systematic destruction based on scientific principles. The forward observers who directed British artillery fire were among the most skilled soldiers in the British Army. These men operated close to German positions. They identified targets. They calculated ranges and bearings. They directed fire via radio to gun batteries miles behind the lines. The job was extraordinarily dangerous. Forward observers were priority targets for German snipers and artillery. Many were killed or wounded, but the survivors became extraordinarily effective at their job. They could estimate ranges within yards by eye. They could recognize different types of German fortifications and know exactly what ammunition would be most effective. They developed a sixth sense for where German positions were located. German commanders hated and feared these observers because they made British artillery so deadly accurate. The British had also developed counter-battery tactics that were far superior to German methods. Counter-battery fire meant using artillery to destroy enemy artillery. The side that could suppress enemy guns had enormous advantage. British counter-battery work was based on scientific detection and rapid response. Microphones and flash spotting equipment detected German guns when they fired. The position was calculated mathematically. British guns would open fire on the German battery within minutes. German artillerymen discovered that firing more than a few rounds from one position was suicidal. British guns would find them and destroy them. This forced German artillery to displace constantly. They couldn't establish firing positions. They couldn't provide sustained support to their infantry. German commanders complained bitterly about British artillery dominance but couldn't solve the problem. Training had been crucial to British artillery success. British gunners went through months of intensive training before being sent into combat. They drilled endlessly on speed and accuracy. They practiced firing at all ranges in all conditions. They learned maintenance and repair, so guns would keep working in combat. They studied mathematics and ballistics, so they understood the science behind their work. By the time they reached the battlefield, British gunners were professionals who could perform under extreme stress. German artillery training had been cut shorter as the war progressed. German gunners in 1944 were not as skilled as those who had fought in 1940. British gunners in 1944 were far more skilled than those who had fought in 1940. This qualitative advantage mattered enormously in combat. British artillery also had better logistics. British guns never ran short of ammunition. Supply lines delivered shells to the batteries no matter what. Trucks and trains moved millions of rounds from factories to the front. Storage dumps held reserves that could sustain days of heavy firing. When British artillery opened fire, it could continue firing for hours if necessary. German artillery faced constant ammunition shortages. Shells were rationed. Batteries were ordered to limit firing to conserve stocks. German gunners wanted to provide more support to their infantry, but literally ran out of ammunition. This gave British forces another advantage. They could use artillery freely, while German forces had to carefully conserve their limited ammunition. The psychological impact of British artillery became one of its most important effects. German soldiers who survived British bombardments were often too shaken to fight effectively. The noise alone was traumatic. The ground shook continuously. The air filled with dirt and smoke and flying metal. Men cowered in their positions, unable to move or think. When the barrage lifted and British infantry attacked, German soldiers were in no condition to resist. Many surrendered immediately. Others fled. Relatively few fought effectively. German officers complained that their men's morale collapsed under British artillery fire. But there was nothing the officers could do about it. No amount of training or ideology could prepare men for the sheer terror of a British stonk. Major von Luck would soon discover all of this personally. As he stood in his bunker on the morning of June 6th, confident in the protection of 6 feet of concrete, British forward observers were already identifying his position. British gunners were already calculating firing data. British commanders were already deciding how many guns would be necessary to eliminate this bunker. The answer they came up with was overwhelming. Von Luck's confidence in German engineering was about to meet British artillery at its most destructive. The concrete walls he trusted to protect him were about to be turned into his tomb. The British artillery preparation for Normandy had been meticulous. Months before the invasion, aerial photographs were analyzed to identify every German fortification. Every bunker was plotted on detailed maps. Intelligence officers estimated the construction methods and thickness of concrete. Engineers calculated how much explosive force would be needed to destroy each position. All of this information was compiled into fire plans that allocated specific gun batteries to specific targets. When the invasion began, British artillery already knew exactly what it needed to do. The scale of British artillery preparation was staggering. More than 2,000 field guns and medium guns supported the British and Canadian landings. Hundreds of additional heavy guns provided support from fixed positions in England. The Royal Artillery had assembled more firepower than any military force in history. The ammunition stockpiles were enormous. Millions of shells had been manufactured and transported to southern England. Supply ships carried additional ammunition across the Channel. British planners had ensured that their artillery would never run short of shells, no matter how heavy the fighting became. The gun crews who would fire these weapons were veterans who had been fighting for years. Many had served in North Africa, where they had learned to destroy German positions in the desert. Others had fought in Italy, where they had perfected techniques for destroying German mountain fortifications. All of them had been trained specifically for the Normandy operation. They had practiced the fire plans until they could execute them perfectly. They had rehearsed communications procedures until coordination was flawless. They had studied photographs of their targets until they could recognize them instantly. British artillery was ready. German fortifications were not. The German army in Normandy had prepared elaborate defenses, but those defenses were designed to stop infantry and tanks. They were not designed to resist the kind of concentrated artillery fire that British guns could deliver. German engineers had built bunkers that could resist individual shells. They had not built bunkers that could resist hundreds of shells falling in the same place. The mathematics were simple but brutal. Any structure, no matter how strong, would eventually fail under sustained bombardment. British artillery had enough guns and enough ammunition to sustain bombardment on any target until it was destroyed. German fortifications could delay British attacks. They could not stop them. The concrete that German soldiers trusted was about to prove far less protective than they believed. Major von Luck was about to become one of the first German officers to experience what British artillery could really do. His bunker had been identified by British intelligence months earlier. A forward observer had been given his position as a priority target. British gunners had already loaded shells into their breeches. The fire mission was about to begin. Von Luck had no idea that the war he understood was about to change completely. The rules of fortress warfare that had protected him through years of combat were about to be rewritten. British artillery was about to teach the German army a lesson it would never forget. Concrete was not invincible. German engineering was not superior. And the British were not the army Germany remembered from the First World War. The first shells began to fall at precisely 7:30 in the morning. Major von Luck heard them coming. The whistle of shells dropping from high altitude was unmistakable. He had heard that sound countless times. It never caused him particular concern while he was safe inside his bunker. The explosions when the shells hit were loud. The bunker shook slightly. Dust fell from the ceiling. Von Luck glanced at his watch and made a note in his log. British artillery opening fire. Nothing to be concerned about. He expected the bombardment would last 20 or 30 minutes. Then it would stop and British infantry would attack. His men in their bunkers would emerge and repel the attack. This was how battles worked. But the bombardment didn't stop after 20 minutes. It didn't stop after 30. Minutes. Shell after shell continued to fall. Von Luck began to feel the first stirrings of unease. British artillery usually fired in short, intensive bursts. This sustained bombardment was unusual. More concerning was the effect on his bunker. Each explosion made the structure shake more violently. Cracks appeared in the concrete walls. The electric lights flickered and went out. Emergency lanterns provided dim illumination. Dust and concrete fragments continued to fall from the ceiling. The noise was becoming intolerable, a continuous roar of explosions that made thinking difficult. Von Luck tried to use his radio to contact other positions. Static filled the airwaves. He couldn't reach anyone. Either the radios were failing or the antennas had been destroyed. He tried his telephone line. Dead. The line had been cut by shellfire. He was isolated. He had no communication with his battalion or with higher command. He didn't know if this bombardment was hitting just his position or all German positions. He didn't know what was happening to his men in other bunkers. The isolation was almost as frightening as the bombardment itself. After an hour of continuous shelling, von Luck began to understand that he was facing something he had never encountered before. This wasn't ordinary artillery fire. This was systematic destruction. The British weren't trying to suppress his position. They were trying to eliminate it completely. Shell after shell was falling on the same spot. The explosions were creating a crater around and on top of his bunker. With each explosion, more concrete chipped away. With each explosion, the bunker's structural integrity weakened. Von Luck realized with growing horror that his fortress might not be as invincible as he had believed. The men trapped in the bunker with him were showing signs of severe stress. These were veteran soldiers who had fought on the Russian front. They were not easily frightened, but the sustained bombardment was breaking them. Some were covering their ears and rocking back and forth. Others stared blankly at the walls as more cracks appeared. One young officer was praying quietly. Another was writing what appeared to be a letter home. The professional confidence that had characterized these men earlier was evaporating. They were beginning to understand that they might not survive. Von Luck tried to maintain discipline and calm. He ordered his men to move to the deepest part of the bunker where they might have more protection. He assured them that the bombardment would end soon. British guns couldn't sustain this rate of fire indefinitely. They would run out of ammunition. But even as he said these words, Von Luck was beginning to doubt them. The bombardment showed no signs of slackening. If anything, it was intensifying. More shells were falling now than at the beginning. The British were adding more guns to the fire mission. Outside the bunker, British forward observers were adjusting fire. They could see that shells were hitting the target, but the bunker was still standing. They called for heavier guns. Medium artillery joined the bombardment. The 5.5-inch guns fired shells that weighed 100 pounds. These shells had far more destructive power than the 25-pounder field gun shells that had started the bombardment. When the heavier shells began hitting, Von Luck's bunker started to come apart. A particularly heavy explosion shook the entire structure. Part of the ceiling collapsed. Concrete blocks weighing hundreds of pounds crashed down. One man was killed instantly. 2 others were trapped under rubble. The survivors scrambled to pull them free. The air filled with concrete dust so thick it was hard to breathe. Men coughed and gasped. Von Luck realized that even if they weren't killed by shells, they might suffocate if the ventilation system failed. The bunker that had seemed so safe an hour ago had become a death trap. Von Luck made a decision that went against all his training. He would have to abandon the bunker. Staying inside meant certain death as the structure continued to collapse. Going outside during an artillery barrage was extremely dangerous, but it offered better survival odds than remaining in a collapsing building. He ordered his men to prepare to evacuate. They would wait for a brief pause in the shelling and then rush out. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance they had. The British guns did pause, not because they were running low on ammunition, but because the forward observer had lost sight of the target through the smoke and dust. He called for a brief halt to let the air clear so he could assess damage. The pause lasted perhaps 90 seconds. That was enough. Von Luck led his men up the bunker stairs and out into daylight. What they saw was apocalyptic. The landscape had been transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters. Trees were gone. Buildings were rubble. The bunker they had just left was a shattered ruin. Half the roof had collapsed. The walls were cracked and crumbling. Another few minutes of bombardment would have buried them all. They ran. They didn't head toward German lines because they didn't know where German lines were anymore. They ran away from the shell fire. British observers spotted them. Additional shells began to fall. Von Luck and his men dove into a crater and huddled at the bottom. Shells exploded around them. Shrapnel whizzed overhead. The men who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts were reduced to cowering in a hole, while British artillery tried to kill them. 2 more men died in that crater. Shrapnel caught them before they could get low enough. Von Luck himself was wounded by a shell fragment that gashed his leg. He bound the wound with a field dressing and prayed that the bombardment would end. It did end. Eventually, after nearly 3 hours of continuous fire. By that time, Von Luck's position had been completely destroyed. His bunker was ruins. His guns were wrecked. His men were dead, wounded, or scattered. He had no communication with higher command. He had no idea what was happening elsewhere in the battle. He was no longer an effective military unit. He was just a small group of traumatized survivors trying to stay alive. British infantry advanced through the area later that day and found no organized resistance. Von Luck and his remaining men surrendered without firing a shot. They were too shocked to fight. The interrogation of Von Luck and other German officers captured in Normandy provided British intelligence with valuable insights into the effectiveness of their artillery tactics. The Germans consistently reported that British artillery was the most frightening and most effective weapon they had faced. They described bombardments that went on for hours. They described bunkers that they had believed were impregnable being systematically destroyed. They described the complete collapse of morale among their troops. One German officer told his interrogators that he had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He said that nothing he had experienced compared to British artillery in Normandy. The British bombardment of German positions in Normandy was not unique. It was part of a systematic approach that the British would use throughout the campaign in northwest Europe. Every German strongpoint was identified, analyzed, and destroyed by artillery before British infantry attacked. The Germans could not construct fortifications fast enough or strong enough to resist this treatment. German commanders quickly learned that ordering troops to hold fortified positions was a death sentence. The British would simply pound the position with artillery until it ceased to exist. German soldiers would be buried in the rubble of their own bunkers. The psychological impact on German troops was profound and lasting. German infantry increasingly refused to occupy prepared defensive positions. They knew these positions attracted British artillery fire. They preferred to dig shallow slit trenches that were harder to detect. But this deprived them of the protection that fortifications were supposed to provide. German commanders were caught in an impossible dilemma. If they ordered their troops into bunkers, British artillery destroyed the bunkers. If they ordered their troops to dig field fortifications, British tanks overran them easily. There was no good answer. British artillery had created a tactical situation where German defensive doctrine simply didn't work. The ammunition consumption required to achieve these results was staggering. British artillery in Normandy fired more than 7 million shells in the first month of the campaign. That was more ammunition than the entire British Army had fired in the first 3 years of the war. The logistical achievement of delivering that much ammunition to the guns was almost as impressive as the gunnery itself. Hundreds of ships carried shells across the channel. Thousands of trucks distributed them from ports to gun positions. Depots held millions of rounds in reserve. The system never failed. British guns never went silent for lack of shells. German generals who studied British operations after the war consistently cited artillery as the decisive factor. Germany simply couldn't match British firepower. The technical sophistication of British gunnery also impressed German professionals. German officers who had dismissed British artillery as unsophisticated discovered that British methods were actually more advanced than German methods. The survey techniques that allowed British guns to fire accurately without registration, the radio communications that allowed rapid fire control, the predicted fire methods that allowed guns to hit targets they had never seen. All of these represented technical and doctrinal advances that Germany had not matched. Some German officers concluded after the war that British artillery in 1944 was the best artillery in the world, better than German, better than American, better than Soviet. The British had taken an arm that was mediocre in 1940 and transformed it into a war-winning capability. The destruction of German bunkers by British artillery had strategic implications beyond the immediate battlefield. German defensive doctrine for the entire war had emphasized fortress construction. The Atlantic Wall, the Gothic Line in Italy, the Siegfried Line in Germany. All of these were based on the assumption that concrete fortifications could resist artillery and would force attackers to commit to costly infantry assaults. British artillery demonstrated that this assumption was false. Concrete could be destroyed by concentrated bombardment. Fortresses became traps rather than strong points. This forced Germany to reconsider its entire defensive strategy, but by the time German commanders understood the problem, it was too late to implement solutions. Germany no longer had the resources or the time to develop new defensive methods. The veterans of British artillery who had perfected these methods received relatively little public recognition. The infantry who captured ground received medals and praise. The pilots who flew over Germany became famous. But the gunners who made both possible worked in relative obscurity. They fired their guns miles behind the front lines. They rarely saw the enemy. They didn't capture prisoners or territory. They just fired shell after shell according to calculated fire missions. But their contribution to victory was enormous. Without British artillery, the Normandy invasion might have failed. The advance through France would certainly have been slower and bloodier. The destruction of German defensive positions by artillery saved thousands of British and Canadian lives. The gunners who achieved this deserved far more credit than they received. Major von Lux survived the war. He eventually wrote a memoir describing his experiences. He devoted an entire chapter to British artillery and its devastating effectiveness. He wrote that German officers before Normandy had not understood what British artillery had become. They remembered British gunnery from the First World War and early Second World War. They assumed British methods hadn't changed. This assumption cost Germany heavily. Von Luck wrote that sitting in his bunker on June 6th, confident that 6 feet of concrete would protect him, he had been living in a fantasy. British artillery had long since developed the capability to destroy such bunkers. He just hadn't known it. His education was brutal and nearly fatal. He ended his account with a simple observation: "We laughed at British artillery until our bunkers turned to dust. Then we stopped laughing." The story of British artillery in the Second World War is ultimately a story of transformation through necessity. The British Army in 1940 had artillery that was competent but not outstanding. Defeat in France revealed serious deficiencies. Rather than accept these limitations, the British systematically addressed every problem. They improved their guns. They revolutionized their fire control methods. They developed new ammunition. They trained their crews to unprecedented standards. They created logistic systems that could sustain massive fire rates. By 1944, they had built the most effective artillery arm in the world. German officers who dismissed British capabilities learned painfully that they had underestimated their enemy. The concrete bunkers that German engineering produced were impressive, but British artillery was more impressive. In the contest between German defensive works and British gunnery, gunnery won decisively. The lesson was written in the rubble of thousands of destroyed bunkers across France and Germany. Fortress construction was no defense against scientific artillery, systematically applied with unlimited ammunition. The British had developed a method of war that rendered traditional defensive tactics obsolete, and they had done it through steady improvement and relentless professionalism rather than revolutionary technology. The guns that destroyed German bunkers were not dramatically different from guns available in 1940, but the men operating them and the systems directing them were completely transformed. That transformation turned British artillery from a supporting arm into a war-winning weapon.